Burmese pythons have devastated native wildlife in the Everglades.
I mean, I think it's like an alien thing, like, right? It can,
Yeah.
I mean, they lose teeth and they grow them back. They have regenerative organ growth.
For nearly 3 decades, Burmese pythons have been spreading through the Everglades, wiping out native animals and turning Florida from a once pristine wilderness into an ecosystem breaking apart on a massive scale. But recent footage reveals something far more serious. It shows a hidden consequence no one expected, and a desperate gamble once mocked by the world. The pythons are still there, but they are no longer the only force tearing the ecosystem apart. What researchers have found in the Everglades points to an entirely new layer of collapse, one strong enough to overturn everything scientists thought they understood about this shattered wetland. Everglades, before everything collapsed. The Everglades was once one of the most remarkable wilderness areas in the United States. It was not a dense forest or a vast lake, but a living sheet of vegetation stretching across more than 1.5 million acres. It was home to raccoons, marsh rabbits, bobcats, turtles, alligators, herons, and hundreds of other species that shared the land in a rhythm that had barely changed for thousands of years. For the people of Florida, the Everglades was more than scenery. It was a natural shield against flooding, the source of fresh water for all of South Florida, and a symbol of a wild landscape that humans could never truly tame. During the dry season, the water would withdraw and reveal warm, open ground where birds of prey gathered to hunt. During the wet season, water returned with fish, frogs, turtles, and a burst of life that swept across the wetlands. It was one of the richest, most complex, and also most fragile ecosystems in the country. No one imagined this system could ever be destroyed. But that is exactly what happened, and it began with an animal that should never have been here. In the 1980s and 1990s, Burmese pythons appeared in pet stores as small, harmless-looking snakes. They were everywhere, sold cheaply, and many people thought owning a huge exotic snake was exciting. The problem came later. These snakes grew far too fast, turning from creatures the size of a child's arm into 3 or 4 meter predators within a few years. When owners could no longer handle them, many quietly released them into the Everglades. In 1992, a Category 5 hurricane named Andrew swept across Florida. It destroyed a major reptile facility on the outskirts of Miami and released even more Burmese pythons into the wild. People believed this was the true beginning of the invasion. But evidence recorded later told a different story. Pythons had already been living in the Everglades since 1979, more than a decade before the storm. Andrew simply gave scattered groups the chance to come together, move deeper into the wetlands, and begin reproducing out of sight. After the storm, one thing became clear. The Everglades was no longer the place scientists once knew, the collapse of native wildlife. When the first Burmese pythons settled into the Everglades, no one believed they could transform an entire landscape. But they possessed every trait that made them the perfect predator here. They were powerful, patient, and well adapted to ambush hunting. And they came from a part of the world where they had long dealt with animals similar to those in Florida. Native wildlife, on the other hand, had never faced a predator like this. Burmese pythons do not chase. They hide beneath sawgrass, blend into dark water, and wait for animals to wander past. In the Everglades, everything from raccoons and marsh rabbits to small mammals and ground birds became easy prey. One strike and one tightening of their coils were all it took. The real problem lay in what these animals represented. They were the foundation of the food chain, feeding bobcats, foxes, owls, eagles, and even young alligators. Once they began to disappear, every predator above them suffered. Biologists described the speed of this decline as unlike anything they had ever seen, far too fast to be natural. By 2012, the numbers were undeniable. Raccoons were down by more than 99%. Possums had nearly vanished. Bobcats had declined by over 80%. The figures sounded like a mistake, but repeated surveys showed the same results. Areas once full of rustling animals were now marked by long, eerie silence. The effect moved up the chain quickly. Birds of prey expanded their hunting ranges, burning more energy and producing fewer offspring. Young alligators, which depended heavily on small mammals, struggled to survive. Every layer of the ecosystem began to wobble. What troubled researchers most was how quickly the pythons adapted. They grew fast, learned fast, and seemed to understand how to avoid people. They stayed hidden in tangled terrain, slipped into drainage culverts, or buried themselves in shallow mud. In a landscape as enormous as the Everglades, finding each snake became impossible. Worse still, Burmese pythons reproduced at a pace no control effort could match. A single female could lay dozens or even hundreds of eggs at a time. If only a few survived, the population continued to rise. The number of snakes removed each year was only a tiny fraction of the total. By this point, the Everglades had not only lost small mammals, it was losing the balance that had kept it functioning for thousands of years. Scientists often described what they were hearing as silence, a silence that felt heavier than any roar. No more rustling of animals moving through grass, no more warning calls from birds, no sign of the busy living system that once filled this place. All of it caused by a predator with no natural enemy in this land. The battle humans could never win. When Burmese pythons began wiping out almost every small mammal in the Everglades, Florida had no choice but to respond. But the first attempts humans made carried more desperation than strategy. For years, state agencies tried anything they could imagine, from practical field methods to ideas that felt like they came straight out of a reality show. In 2013, Florida launched the Python Challenge. Anyone brave enough or simply curious enough could enter the Everglades to hunt pythons for prize money. Newspapers showed photos of people carrying snake hooks and flashlights, excited about a strange public contest. Many thought the event would make a real difference, but the number of snakes caught was tiny compared to the actual size of the population. Even trained hunters who were paid by the hour and worked the wetlands every day struggled to keep up. They captured hundreds, then thousands over the years. Yet compared to an estimated 100,000 to 300,000 snakes moving through the marsh, their efforts barely made an impact. Officials then turned to technology. Drones equipped with thermal cameras were deployed with the hope of spotting snakes from above. The idea sounded promising. But the Everglades was simply too hot. The ground was hot, the water was hot. Pythons, being cold-blooded, once-pristine adjusted their temperature to match the environment. On a thermal camera, a python lying still in the grass looked no different from a warm patch of mud. The technology failed almost entirely. More unusual ideas followed, such as using robotic rabbits that emitted heat and sound to lure snakes. This approach was quickly abandoned. Pythons are ambush hunters. They do not chase loud-moving targets, they wait. A stiff, mechanical decoy was never going to fool them. The most effective method came from a very different direction. Researchers attached tracking devices to large male pythons and released them back into the wild during breeding season. These males often led biologists directly to hidden females carrying eggs. This was one of the few strategies that truly worked, but it required enormous time and effort and could only be used on a small number of snakes in an enormous landscape. Meanwhile, the pythons continued to reproduce, and the Everglades remained far larger than any tool humans could deploy. What made the situation even worse was a strange pattern hunters began to describe. Many claimed that Burmese pythons seemed to learn over time. They avoided levees where people patrolled. They slipped deeper into tangled wetlands. Some of the tagged males used as scouts even led researchers in circles for days, as if they were trying to mislead them. There is no evidence that pythons are clever in a human sense, but it is clear that they adapt quickly. In a landscape as immense as the Everglades, a little adaptation is more than enough to keep humans permanently behind. By this point, Florida faced a difficult truth. No technology, no statewide campaign, and no large-scale effort could completely remove Burmese pythons from the Everglades. Everything humans did only slowed them down. Nothing could stop them. What scientists did not expect was that pythons were not the only reason these efforts were failing. Beneath the grass, inside the very animals Floridians thought were harmless, another threat was beginning to spread, and it would make the situation far worse. The hidden enemy. spreading through the wetlands. For many years, people believed Burmese pythons were the sole cause of the Everglades collapse. They were massive, powerful, and almost impossible to control. So when the ecosystem began to fall apart, everyone assumed the python was to blame. But scientists soon started noticing signs that did not fit that explanation. Several native snake species that rarely encountered pythons, and even lived far outside python territory, were dying in large numbers. Many were found thin, gasping, and too weak to move. When these snakes were brought into the lab, the results stunned the entire team. Inside their lungs were tiny white thread-like parasites that were still moving. What they found was Raeliatiella orientalis. It came from Asia and lived naturally inside Burmese pythons. Pythons could carry it for years with little harm, as if their bodies had adapted to it long ago. But Florida's native snakes had no such defenses. Once the larvae entered their lungs, breathing became harder. The lung tissue was inflamed. The airways slowly closed. Eventually, the snake died from exhaustion or suffocation. What made this discovery frightening was that lungworm was not only found in the Everglades, it had reached regions far to the north, places where pythons had never been recorded. This meant the parasite had discovered its own path across Florida. Instead of following pythons, it moved through familiar local animals. Roaches fed on infected waste, lizards fed on roaches, frogs fed on lizards, native snakes fed on frogs. The cycle completed itself. The parasite no longer needed pythons to survive. From that moment on, the invasion no longer had a single culprit. As native snakes declined, a new consequence emerged. Birds of prey such as hawks, owls, and eagles depended on snakes as a major food source. With fewer snakes available, these birds started to starve, reproduced less, and produced fewer young. Other snake-eating species suffered as well. One collapse triggered another, moving up the food chain like the ground beneath Everglades was continuing to sink. This placed the Everglades in a strange position. Pythons were wiping out small mammals, while a second enemy, far smaller and far quieter, was attacking reptiles. A giant predator dominated the landscape while a nearly invisible threat worked inside the bodies of native animals. Two invasions were happening at the same time, creating a second wave of collapse even faster and harder to control than the first. What began as a simple story of pythons destroying the Everglades was no longer true. The reality was more complex and far more frightening. The ecosystem was not only being torn apart from the outside, it was being eaten away from within. And unless something stopped this second wave, it had the potential to erase the very species that were once seen as Florida's last hope. The last gamble, the return of the Indigo King. As every layer of the Everglades began to erode, Florida was forced to confront a difficult question. Was there any way left to push this ecosystem back toward a state where it could defend itself again? The python hunts were not enough. Technology had failed. The parasite was spreading faster than any control effort. And just when every path seemed closed, scientists decided to attempt something that made the world laugh. They released more snakes into the wild, but these were not just any snakes. They were eastern indigo snakes, a species that once served as a top predator in the long-leaf pine ecosystems of the southeastern United States. People called them kings, not for their size, but for the balance they brought. Indigo snakes eat other snakes, both venomous and non-venomous, and are completely immune to rattlesnake venom. In the regions where they once thrived, they kept rodents, small snakes, and lizards in check and helped stabilize the ecosystem. Due to the loss of pine forests and major environmental changes in the previous century, indigo snakes nearly vanished from Florida. Their return was not a sudden experiment. Researchers had spent decades preparing for it by breeding indigos in controlled facilities, restoring longleaf pine habitat, and protecting gopher-tortoise burrows, which the snakes depend on for shelter and nesting. But the plan only began to show real promise when released. Indigos started finding their own food, avoiding predators, and most importantly, reproducing in the wild. That was the turning point no one expected. trail cameras in northern Florida captured two small indigo hatchlings sliding out from the leaf litter. They carried no tracking tags, which meant they were born naturally. For ecologists, that moment felt like a door cracking open. If indigos could stand on their own again, they might reclaim part of the mid-level predator role that the Everglades had been missing for decades. This recovery effort was not without fear. Many worried it would become another mongoose scenario, releasing one species to fix the damage caused by another, only to make the problem worse. But the indigo snake is not invasive. It belongs here. And unlike pythons, indigos do not reproduce explosively, do not disappear endlessly into the marsh, and cannot destroy an entire ecosystem if something goes wrong. They survive only when their environment is healthy, which is exactly why scientists felt they were the only species worth betting on. The indigos also do not need to eliminate the pythons to make a difference. If their numbers grow high enough, they can stabilize the mid-level predator tier, control smaller snake populations, and ease the pressure on snake-eating birds that are currently declining. And even though indigos have not yet reached the Everglades where the pythons dominate, their comeback in northern Florida proves the ecosystem is not completely helpless. The return of the indigo snake is not a victory. It is a signal, a sign that nature still has a chance to repair itself if the right pieces are put in place at the right time. But a much harder question remains: can the indigos grow strong enough before the ecosystem is pushed past the point of recovery by pythons and the parasite? It's a three-sided battle and an unpredictable future. The Everglades today no longer resemble any ecosystem ecologists once understood. It is no longer a stable wetland with ancient natural rhythms. Instead, it now sits under the pressure of three forces pulling the system in different directions, none of them slowing down. This is no longer a battle between humans and pythons. It is a complex confrontation that may shape the fate of southern Florida for decades. The first force, and the most visible one, remains the Burmese python. Pythons dominate the small mammal tier, erasing the basic food supply that dozens of native species depend on. Every year, thousands of new individuals hatch and silently fill the gaps humans cannot reach. They do not just occupy space, they alter the flow of energy through the system, change how animals move, and turn once lively areas into silent stretches of wetlands. They are not disappearing, they are spreading and strengthening. The second force is far more dangerous because it is almost impossible to see. The lung parasite Raeliatiella orientalis is attacking native snakes from below, destroying the protective layer the ecosystem once depended on to stay balanced. It spreads through pathways no one expected, moving through water, insects, lizards, frogs, and finally into native snakes. Once it has established itself, it no longer needs the python. It multiplies on its own, pushes farther north, and quietly empties another tier of the food web. This leads researchers to a frightening question. If pythons erase the mammals, and the parasite erases the reptiles, how many tiers does the Everglades have left? To lose the third force is the only one working in nature's favor: the return of the eastern indigo snake. In the northern forests, indigos are recovering and breeding, reclaiming a role they held for centuries. They cannot stop pythons yet, but they can rebuild stability in the mid-level predator tier, which has been empty for far too long. The indigo snake cannot save the Everglades on its own, but it represents what both science and nature desperately need: a native species capable of pulling the balance back toward where it once belonged. The problem is that these three forces are not acting separately. They are moving toward each other from three different directions. The pythons are spreading north. The parasite is spreading faster than the pythons. The indigos are moving south. Sooner or later, their paths will cross, and no one knows what will happen when they do. Can an indigo snake stand against a fully grown python? Can the parasite infect the indigos? Will a newly restored native species survive a threat no part of this ecosystem has ever faced before? The Everglades is entering what scientists call a new state, a form of ecosystem that no longer resembles its past and has not yet found a stable future. It may eventually settle into a new balance where pythons, parasites, and native species all coexist in a completely different structure. but it may also continue collapsing step by step in ways humans will not recognize until it is too late. The question is no longer how to remove the pythons. The real question is what direction this ecosystem will stabilize toward and whether we still have any control over that outcome. As the three forces continue to move closer, the Everglades is rewriting its own future in ways no one could have predicted on the day the first pythons were released into the swamp.